synaesthesia. I don't have synaesthesia, but people who have synaesthesia experience the ordinary world in quite extraordinary ways. So some people, as they're listening to my words now, each word might be a distinct taste in their mouth, or maybe they see each word spelled out in front of them like as coloured ticker tape. For other people, listening to music is not just an auditory experience, it's an audio-visual experience, like an abstract art show in which there are lines and splodges and flashes and moving, dancing textures and shapes. I'll give you a more formal definition in a bit, but let me just go through some concrete examples first. So this is one of the most commonly studied type of synaesthesia. This is about 1 to 2% of the population who would have this, called Grapheme-Colour Synaesthesia. You would see similar things for Japanese kanji and kana as well. It's been studied in other languages. And basically the phenomenology is something like this, that when you see text on a page, you might superimpose colours onto the page, or you might imagine or see a copy of those colours automatically in your mind's eye. For other people, similarly with speech, as they listen to speech, they might see the words spelled out in their characteristic colours. This here at the bottom isn't an actual research finding, it's a cartoon, if you will, from Ramachandran and Hubbard as to how they imagine that this works. That you would have parts of the brain dedicated to colour processing and parts of the brain dedicated to recognising print. And in effect, these are connected together in synaesthetes that aren't there in others. There is some evidence for this, but what you kind of see in this kind of simple explanational model is that the rest of the brain looks the same as everybody else's. In effect, that the only thing that's different from synaesthetes is that they're just connecting these things together. And that's an idea that I'm going to challenge a little bit here. Everybody will know somebody who has something like this. This is called sequence space synaesthesia, and for time and numbers and so on, people would have their own particular mental map or a visualization of the calendar. Sometimes they're colored, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're outside of their body. This person here says, if I'm meeting somebody at 4:30 on a Tuesday, it would look like this, which helps me remember, where is it there, 4:30 on a Tuesday. So again, they've got the colors, the spatial location, and so on. This is one of the first case studies of synaesthesia I worked with. And basically, he experienced flavors in his mouth whenever he listens to words or hears them. And he drew for London the actual flavors that he experiences, and they're kind of quintessential British food, particularly growing up in the 1960s. So again, a Japanese synaesthete is probably not going to have boiled potatoes and warm semolina and so on. Their synaesthesia might look quite different. So again, there are these elements, but he describes them in this way. And sure enough, his brain responds differently when you play him a word that is disgusting, tasting, and so on here in the insula. So I don't know whether anybody can hear this. Okay. So this is a silent movie. So if you are hearing it, you're in the minority. This was actually somebody at Caltech in Christoph Koch's group. I'll stop, like it's a bit annoying. And they were actually studying deaf people. If you show people who are born deaf a movie such as this, they will activate their auditory cortex. So this visual motion stimuli will activate in a deaf person's brain parts of the brain normally involved in hearing. Now, of course, we don't know that deaf people are literally hearing this because they don't know what hearing is if they're born without it. But we can have synaesthetes with normal hearing who would say, when I see this, I hear a kind of maybe a pitch modulated noise or a whooshing, shooshing kind of noise. Again, a minority of people, relatively common here. So these are examples of synaesthesia. Let's link it to consciousness first of all. So this is William James, the philosopher. He was aware of synaesthesia. He attended the first ever conference, or it was a symposium on synaesthesia, one of the first ever psychology conferences, actually. And he said descriptions of synaesthesia will fill the reader with a one. Whoops. Descriptions of synaesthesia will fill the reader with a wondering sense of the complication of our mental workshop, and by increasing his insight into the extraordinary diversities of inner scenery, it will tone down his hopes, if ever he had one, of a general union of all intelligences on a purely logical and articulable basis. So what he's saying here is the idea that we think of cognition or intelligence as kind of being abstract logical thought, but here are a bunch of people who are superficially appear like everybody else. They appear to be intelligent, normal members of society who have a completely different inner scenery, a completely different way of thinking. And he's effectively saying, if you have this rich inner world, how can you have a general theory of cognition or a general theory of intelligence? That's what he's saying. So how can you have a general theory of cognition or intelligence? How do you kind of slot these anomalous experiences into them? Well, one way is kind of coming back to that Ramachandran Hubbard cartoon of just kind of positioning synaesthesia kind of there as something that stands apart from the rest of the brain, what I kind of call a dangling qualia. So here we can imagine that synaesthesia is a subjective altered reality. This is otherwise superimposed on a normal mind and brain. If this is the case, then we have unusual conscious experiences that are part of a normal mind and brain. And here, of course, this raises interesting questions about what the function of them is. And if anything, it kind of forces down a line of synaesthesia being kind of mysterious or epiphenomenal. An alternative viewpoint is that what we're seeing here are, to some extent, the tip of the iceberg, that the unusual experiences in synaesthesia reflect an unusually structured brain, an unusually structured cognitive system. So it's not unusual experiences on a normal brain, it's unusual experiences on an unusual brain, okay? And that's the angle that I'm pushing at here. Now, whether or not so in effect, this is what I'm talking about here. That synaesthesia is kind of what we see in these people. They say, yeah, I have colors for letters and numbers, I experience taste for words. But the claim here is that these unusual experiences are underpinned by unusual things beneath the surface. So unusual cognition, unusual brain structure and function, and an unusual genotype in effect. So the unusual experiences are linked to these unusual functions. And what this might mean actually is that even in this model, maybe the synesthetic experiences are not really what's interesting. Maybe what's interesting is all the thing that goes underneath here. Maybe it's all this stuff here that's interesting, and synesthesia is just the thing that gives us the handle on what's going on in their brain. And what I mean about them being largely hidden here is that often I give a talk like this and people go home, if it's, to the member of the public, maybe they talk to their husband or wife and they discover that the person that they're married to has synaesthesia. So again, synaesthesia kind of brings home that we all construct a private reality and that one reality is different from another and so on. But nevertheless, although you might live with somebody for many years with synaesthesia and not know that they have it, actually, if you give these people a bunch of questionnaires, cognitive measures, if you scan their brain, you will show that their brains are different. So although the differences appear subtle, when you actually search for them, they're there. And we just dismiss them, oh, well, that's what this person is like. But actually, we find that synaesthetes are all alike in how they think and how they behave in a way that is rather predictable. Okay, so this is what I'll talk about. So I've given you an overview of what synaesthesia is. I'll give you a formal definition. I'll ask the question whether we all have it. And a spoiler alert is that I'll say we don't. And then I'll talk about the stuff beneath the surface of the iceberg. What causes it? What is the underlying cognitive profile of synaesthetes and why does it exist? So I think of synaesthesia as having three defining characteristics. So the first is that they're induced experiences. And what I mean by this is that they pair two things together. So numbers trigger colors, words trigger taste. And this is different from the standard thinking about hallucinations, which are other anomalous experiences which aren't necessarily triggered. They occur spontaneously, or they don't have this reliable one-to-one mapping in this way. Second one is that they're involuntary. So by involuntary means that the synaesthetes say that they can't switch them on or off. This obviously makes them feel like their perceptual experiences, even though they're being triggered by stuff in the head, that they're all, to some extent, synesthetic experiences are like imagination, but they don't feel like imagination because the synesthete doesn't feel that they're actively generating them themselves. We can show that they're involuntary in various cognitive tests. So if you're familiar with the Stroop test, this is, for example, naming the color of a stimulus whilst ignoring what the stimulus actually says. And you could show that synaesthetes have kind of a synaesthetic Stroop experience. So if a synaesthete thinks that a letter A is red in their mind, if you present a green letter A on screen, they will be slow at telling you that it's green because there's something in the back of their head saying, hang on, I think it's also red. They are, in terms of their phenomenology, they are like sensory experiences. It's like tasting, it's like color. That doesn't mean that synaesthetes get confused about their experiences. They can tell real colors from synaesthetic colors by and large, even though the two can interfere. For example, on reaction time studies, they don't get them confused at a phenomenological level. And we can tell that somebody has synaesthesia by doing simple retest reliability. So if we give people a set of numbers and letters and say, what color is the letter A? Then for that synaesthete, the letter A might be red. And if you test them a month, a week, or minutes later, it will still be red. And for people who don't have synaesthesia, they will just generate colors on the fly and they won't have any stability or any precision in the mapping of the colors to letters. Having said that, we can look where are the synaesthetic experiences coming from, and we can show that there are actually some similarities between the synaesthetic associations and associations from the environment, or that are kind of, I suppose, universal truths, if you will, as to how sensory properties are connected together. On the left here, we have what I called pitch luminance correspondences. So here, this is the idea that high pitch is bright and low pitch is dark. So high pitch here is light and low pitch is dark. And we find the same effect in synaesthetes as we do in controls. This has also been found in infants, and it's also been found in other species. So it's been found in chimpanzees and it's been found in dogs. So a synaesthete might, for a high-pitched tone, it might be a very bright kind of pink, for example, and for other people, they might not know whether it's pink or light blue and so on, but it will still be bright. And this seems to be a kind of a universal truth. Here, these are the most common colors for the letters of the alphabet, the Roman alphabet. For synaesthetes, so O tends to be white, C tends to be yellow, and so on. If you give these to people who don't have synaesthesia, they will find this a very confusing task. But if you force them to choose colors, they will get some of them in the same pattern as synaesthetes. So C being yellow, O being white, X being black. People will get 3 or 4-year-old children who are, in all intents and purposes, illiterate will choose some of the same colors. So here you give them, for example, a perspex letter O, a clear letter O, and you give them colored boxes. And you say, I'm looking for one of these shapes. Which colored box shall I open? And a 3 or 4-year-old child will open the white box for a letter O and a black box for a letter X, and so on. And this is partly to do with the shape. There's been a large study done in the States looking at coloured alphabets. For many years, I said that this has nothing to do with synaesthesia. How can it possibly? But actually, there was a set of coloured alphabets that was around for about 10 years. And you can show that this actually biased the synaesthetic alphabet of some of these synaesthetes. So this forces us into a kind of a red flag, if you will, is that I kind of made a claim that synaesthetes experience the world in these remarkable ways. But actually, when we boil it down, they're using many of the same kind of principles and rules as others. My claim about this is that synaesthetes are still actually doing something interesting, even if they're using it in this way. So many thousands, if not millions of people would have encountered these letters. But why is it that people are still re-experiencing them 20 years later and most people aren't? So again, for me, that's still an interesting question. And obviously the phenomenology of why is it that they actually see the colors rather than simply know them, for example, is interesting. But nevertheless, there is some overlap between synaesthesia and other forms of cognition. There is also evidence that synaesthesia is special, so it runs in families, and there would be a genetic basis. So this is a study of twins. So here we've got identical twins and non-identical twins. And basically, if you are identical twins, both pairs are likely to have synaesthesia. But nevertheless, you can have some identical twins, one of which has synaesthesia and one doesn't. So again, it's strongly heritable. But what isn't heritable actually are the types of synaesthesia. So you might have maybe one twin who has coloured letters and numbers, but maybe their brother has a completely different type of synaesthesia. So this suggests that what the genes are doing is that they're not precisely specifying the type of synaesthesia or even the particular associations that develop. What's also interesting to me is that you might have a set of twins, one of which has synaesthesia and one of which does not, even if they're genetically identical, as in these 6 pairs here. But one thing that we don't know, or it hasn't been looked in twins, is whether actually the twin who doesn't have synaesthesia might still think like a synaesthete. Maybe they still think strongly in mental images. Maybe they have some of the personality traits and cognitive characteristics of synaesthetes. And I'll come back to that. So where does this leave synaesthesia in terms of who has it and who doesn't have it, and how it links to regular cognition? So this is my current kind of way of thinking about who has synaesthesia and who doesn't, and whether synaesthesia is more extreme. And one claim is that there exists in the general population what I call a synaesthetic disposition. And these would be a set of predisposing factors, genetic and differences in the brain architecture, that make synaesthesia likely to appear in some people and not likely to appear in others. So in effect, this is kind of like a causal kind of set of triggers for synaesthesia. And we can imagine that this varies continuously in the population, but such that people who have a strong synaesthetic disposition are likely to develop it. So you either have synaesthesia or you do not, but you might have the causes of synaesthesia without having it. So maybe this person here, this person who doesn't have synaesthesia, is the identical twin of somebody who does. So they still have this synaesthetic disposition. They might still think like a synaesthete, but for whatever reason, they don't go the extra mile in developing synaesthesia. The other claim that I'm going to make in this talk is that synaesthesia differs in kind. And some people have multiple kinds of synaesthesia, that some people have synaesthetic taste and synaesthetic colours and so on. And basically the claim here is that if you have a stronger kind of genetic or brain-based difference, your brain just goes ping, 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 ping in multiple locations, and you develop multiple forms of synaesthesia. So these people here have more extreme brains and more extreme forms of synaesthesia. So synaesthesia is something that you either have or you don't have, but the causes of synaesthesia might be more continuous. And within synaesthetes, some people might have it more strongly than others. And that's in effect the key claims that I'm going to make, is that there are a set of causal mechanisms that make synaesthesia likely to emerge in some people and not others. These causal mechanisms include genetic and brain differences and cognitive differences. This is probabilistic. So what it means is that it makes synaesthesia likely to happen, but it doesn't necessarily make it inevitable. You might have the causes of synaesthesia without having synaesthesia itself. And we can talk about what that means. Some synaesthetes are likely to be more extreme. What it might also mean in terms of functions and adaptive value is actually the thing that is more interesting or meaningful might be this. It might be having a different kind of neurocognitive architecture, having this synaesthetic disposition, and having synaesthesia itself might be kind of functionless. So again, this raises interesting questions in terms of the conscious phenomenology. But the reason synaesthesia might be adaptive is about having a different kind of cognition rather than the actual experiences themselves, the stuff that's under the water of the iceberg rather than the thing that you're seeing on top, if you will. So this is evidence from other studies that synaesthetes have a distinct neural architecture. Basically, there isn't a huge consensus as to how this is implemented in the brain. Everybody talks about connectivity. One of the things that I'm doing at the moment is trying to collect a collection of 100 synaesthete brains using the Human Connectome project. But this is just a flavor of the kinds of things that people have looked at. So here, this is looking at grey matter thickness, and in effect, you're correlating the similarity structure of grey matter. So it's asking, is the grey matter structure of this region similar to the grey matter structure in that region? And synaesthetes have, if you look at the synesthetic brain, this much more dense pattern of similarity here. This is resting state with fMRI, and what they did here is they took one region of the brain, it was a region of visual cortex involved in colours, and they just had a look when the brain's at rest, what other regions of the brain correlate with that. So when this region fluctuates up and down, what other regions are fluctuating up and down in parallel? What you find in people without synaesthesia is that that you get a kind of a small network of regions around that kind of go up and down with this. And in synaesthetes, you've got a much wider network, both within the visual system and outside of the visual system, here shown in circles. So again, the synaesthetes they might have more global differences, I suppose, in brain architecture rather than just a pairing of two things together in the brain. And we see some of these things also in the first-degree relatives of synaesthetes. So again, this is a study by Colazzoli et al. Showing that the people who are the brothers and sisters of synaesthetes who don't have synaesthesia are nevertheless showing a different kind of brain type, if you will. But there are still gaps in the neuroimaging literature. We don't have a single kind of diagnostic marker of this, and everybody's looked at connectivity measures in different ways, and that's a gap that we're trying to fill. So if we think about William James's question, do synaesthetes have a different kind of cognitive style, a different way of thinking? Do they have a different set of abilities? And if so, why? So some of the most interesting case studies of synaesthesia are these kind of exceptional case studies, such as Daniel Tammet or Shereshevsky, reported by Luria. So these are two case studies of people who have phenomenal memory. So the case of Luria's subject, this is somebody who's described as having an infinite memory. You could remember strings of nonsense syllables like ma, ga, ba, la, da, weeks and months and years later. And he saw these syllables as kind of coloured splashes and lines and so on in his mind's eye. He had amazing memory. Daniel Tammet is somebody who has synaesthesia, but also has autism, Asperger's syndrome. And he could memorize pi to 20,000 decimal places. Again, you can do that without synaesthesia, but he did it by memorizing the sequence of the, visualizing the sequence of the digits. He learned Icelandic in a week and so on. The kind of research we've done is looking at whether synaesthetes as a whole have better memory. So not just taking exceptional cases, just taking regular synaesthetes who we recruit from undergraduate populations and so on. This is a meta-analysis of memory and synaesthesia. So each of these dots is a study, not an individual. So in fact, we've got several thousand participants in this. And in effect, what you see here is that if there was no benefit of memory, of synaesthesia and memory, you would be at zero in effect. But what you've got is a shift in the effect size, that synaesthetes are shifted up, that they have a better memory here by here a Cohen's d of 0.6. And a Cohen's d of 0.6 looks like this, that basically everybody gets shifted up in terms of their memory ability. There are some interesting things about this. So some of my colleagues have been a little bit skeptical that this kind of data is that dramatic, because if you actually look at the region of overlap, you find that synaesthetes and controls are actually, there's this very big region of overlap, and that is the case, but there are some reasons why I think it's actually important. You might be a synaesthete with below average memory, but if you didn't have synaesthesia, so if you're a synaesthete with below average memory there, if you didn't have synaesthesia, you'd probably have very below average memory. You would be down there, for example. And interesting things happen at the tail. So if you imagine taking slices through the normal distribution here and looking at what is the proportion of synaesthetes in each slice, these are the numbers that you get at the bottom. So if you look at 2 or 3 standard deviations away from the mean, you find that synaesthetes start to dominate in the tail, such that when you get to extreme ends of the tail, they're almost entirely dominated by synaesthetes. What this means is that if you were to give me 1,000 people and rank them by their memory ability, and then ask me which of these 1,000 people is the person most likely to have synaesthesia, where would I look in that 1,000? Well, I could look at the mean, but that would be a mistake, because although that's where most synaesthetes are, there's an awful lot of non-synaesthetes here. Statistically, the person who's most likely to be a synaesthete in this group of 1,000 is the 1,000th most person in terms of memory ability. This is the person who is more likely to have synaesthesia. So these more moderate shifts in memory ability can drive these kind of fantastical cases of superior memory. And actually, they can have real world importance. So as people get older, their memory goes down. So how does that interact with synaesthesia? So here we've got 4 groups. We've got young people, old people, synaesthetes, and non-synaesthetes. So young synaesthetes, old synaesthetes, old controls, and so on. And we give them a wide variety of memory tests. So one of the puzzling things about synaesthesia is that the enhanced memory isn't just for the things that participate in synaesthesia. They have enhanced memory for a wide range of material, including things that don't seem to trigger their synaesthesia. So even including things like snowflakes, they've got a better memory for knowing whether they've seen a snowflake, for example. And these are the 2 tests here. What you find is that synaesthetes have better memory than people without synaesthesia. And, these are the synaesthetes here, and these are the people without it. And what we find is that young people have better memory than old people. Well, that's, not so exciting. We already know that, don't we? What's interesting are these 2 groups here highlighted in red. So here we've got young controls, and here we've got elderly synaesthetes. If you are a synaesthete in your 60s, you have the memory ability of a 20-year-old undergraduate. Okay, so the memory advantage that synaesthesia gives you is about 4 decades of healthy aging, and that's effectively what you're seeing here. So again, these differences of about 0.6, some of my colleagues say, well, it's not a big difference. Actually, when you phrase it like this, it's quite important. It also means that when people are looking at aging and memory, often you find elderly people who appear to have a very good memory, and the idea is that they haven't aged. What we find in synaesthetes is that they probably have aged. It's just that they've started at a higher level. So synaesthetes' memory does deteriorate with age, but because they're starting at a much higher level, they're deteriorating to the level of a young neurotypical person, in effect, if you will. What about having multiple kinds of synaesthesia? So what we looked at is whether there's a different cognitive profile for people who are more extreme. And if you remember in my model, people who are more extreme might have greater differences in their kind of their synesthetic disposition, in the brain, their genes, and their cognitive profile. So here we have 5 types of synaesthesia: colored letters and numbers, these sequences, taste for words, speech to text, and this is colored music. So each synaesthete can be given a number between 1 and 5, depending on how many of these boxes they tick in terms of what they have. Here we look at mental imagery. So this is the vividness of being able to conjure mental images of, say, touching fur or smelling coffee, and the extent to which it is a realistic sensation versus no sensation at all. If you have no types of synaesthesia, you're not a synaesthete. You're just like 90-odd% of the population. But what we find, irrespective of the sense that we study, the more types of synaesthesia you have, the more vivid your mental imagery. People who have multiple types of synaesthesia can conjure up feelings of touching fur and smelling coffee in ways that are very realistic. And they also have more sensory sensitivity. So this is a questionnaire measure called the Glasgow Sensory Questionnaire that has questions like this. Do bright lights ever hurt your eyes, cause a headache? Do you hate the feel or texture of certain foods in your mouth? This is a questionnaire that's been given to people with autism. So people with autism have a very high sensory sensitivity, and this is the level that people with autism perform at. What we've got here are multiple groups of synaesthetes. You haven't got to understand the different groups because the interesting story is not about the different groups, it's about how much synaesthesia you have. So 0 means you don't have synaesthesia. The more kinds of synaesthesia you have, the greater your sensory sensitivity that you have here. So the more atypical you are with this on these kinds of measures. Why is this? Well, the most intuitive explanation of this goes something like this. So imagine that we've got 3 people here, somebody who doesn't have synaesthesia, somebody who has one kind of synaesthesia, and somebody who has several types of synaesthesia. What you might imagine is that the number of types of synaesthesia are kind of boosting the sensitivity of particular sensory systems. So if you've got 2 the types of synaesthesia, then you're going to go up on those ones that are affected. This makes perfect sense, except when you drill to the data, it's not what you find. You find a completely different pattern that's somewhat more puzzling, and it looks like this. Is that basically, if you have 2 types of synaesthesia, you have more sensory sensitivity across all senses, including things like your vestibular sense. So this is feeling dizzy when you stand up and things such as this. So things that have nothing at all to do with the synaesthesia. And if you think that this makes no sense, I would agree with you. The way you can make sense of it is to turn this around, to turn the direction of cause and effect around, and imagine something like this. The degree of sensitivity from low to high is in effect something like a bias, something like a probability that you are going to develop synaesthesia and a probability that you are going to develop synaesthesia multiple times. But it's not actually specifying the types of synaesthesia you're going to have. So in effect, we can think of this almost like a disposition. If you are a high sensitive person, you are going to be more likely to develop synaesthesia, and you are going to be more likely to develop it multiple times, but you cannot predict exactly whether it's going to manifest itself as taste and so on, because we know that the arrow of causation is rather vague, if you will. But a synaesthesia gene doesn't tell you whether you're going to taste words or have colors for letters and numbers. So again, it suggests that there is this particular bias here. Can you actually take somebody from the population and figure out whether they have synaesthesia or not by giving them measures such as the Glasgow Sensory Questionnaire or measures of personality? That's in effect what we tried to do here. So we took a large group of synaesthetes, a large group of controls, and these are first-degree relatives of synaesthetes. So these are people who say, I don't have synaesthesia, but nevertheless, their brother or sister or son or daughter is reporting synaesthesia. Okay. And what we do is that we give them some standard tests of cognition. So some of them are questionnaires, some of them are behavioral tests with button presses. And these are tests of memory, mental imagery, tests of perception, tests of personality, creativity. This is a measure of autism and a measure of sensory sensitivity. Some of these tests have multiple parts. So our test of personality has 5 dimensions. So we actually, although we've got 7 tests, we end up with 33 kind of measures, if you will, for each person. What we can then do is that we can take what's called a machine learning algorithm that then uses what's called a leave one out procedure. So if we've got 201 participants, we take one person out and we've got the other 200 people. And what we do is that we take one person out and we say, who amongst this other set of 200 people looks like this? Who has a similar cognitive profile to this person? And then we ask the question, who are these people who look like this person a synaesthete or are they a control? Okay. And that's in effect what we're doing in this algorithm. And we don't just find one similar person within the 200. We look for the closest 15 people. So if I've got a set of scores on these measures, I find the 15 people who are more like me, and we look what proportion of those 15 people have synaesthesia. Okay, and that is the basis of the classification. Okay, so this is what the data looks like. So here we've got our different groups. So we've got controls, we've got relatives of people with synaesthesia, and these are people with synaesthesia here. On the y-axis, we've got the probability of being classed as a synaesthete. And this is what I call neighborhood density. So here it's like how many people with a similar score to me are synaesthetes. So if the score is 1, what it means is that all the people who score similar to me on these measures are also synaesthetes. And a score of 0 means that all the people who score similar to me are non-synaesthetes. And a score of 0.5 means that you're looking a little bit like a synaesthete and not. So for those people who have multiple kinds of synaesthesia, you can tell who these people are just by looking at their personality, their memory ability, their mental imagery, and so on, quite reliably. Those people who have 1 or 2, they look, if anything, a little bit more like controls than others. But what you also find is that the relatives of synaesthetes look more like, they have a higher, what I call synaesthetic disposition than controls here. So these differ on this, that they are cognitively more like a synaesthete than a control. In fact, they're about halfway between, which is what you would expect. So what this suggests to me is that there is something like a synaesthetic disposition or a synaesthetic cognitive profile that is indicative of synaesthetes. It is a continuous measure, and it is related to the amount of synaesthesia that you have. Whether or not it is causally related to synaesthesia is obviously much harder to suggest. But again, there are some logical arguments, such as this one here, that it makes more sense to put the direction of cause and effect in this direction than the other direction. But statistically, it's just an association. What about, so far I've talked about synaesthetes as having a particular cognitive profile. And actually, if I were to summarize that cognitive profile, it's that they are pretty good at a lot of things. That this is something that you would probably not be averse to having, But nevertheless, it might put you on a knife edge of certain vulnerabilities. And one of these is a vulnerability to autism. And in fact, a measure of autism is one of the things that's actually diagnostic of synaesthesia, somewhat bizarrely. Autism is often defined in terms of social and communication problems here. So this is a measure called the autism quotient. And what you find here is that synaesthetes, although they are different from controls, they're actually quite far away from people with autism in terms of the kind of social communication problems that they're reporting. But they're much more similar to autistic people in terms of their perceptual characteristics. So they claim, for example, I often notice small sounds when others do not. And in fact, a synaesthete is more like an autistic, somebody with a clinical diagnosis of autism than they are from somebody in the neurotypical population on this questionnaire measure. And actually, this holds true on more objective tests. So this is change blindness, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and you're probably so familiar with it that you know exactly where to look already. For those of you who aren't, there's an object appearing and disappearing. And it is there. Okay. What we find here is that synaesthetes are really good at this task. So this is given to about 80, 90 synaesthetes and a similar number of controls. What we find within our controls is that we also give them a measure of autism, and we can pull out people who are very high on the autism spectrum. That's what these people look like. So the synaesthetes are performing in an autistic-like way on this task. But think about this for a minute. Why is it that having coloured letters and numbers makes you good at this task? It's very hard to imagine that it's something directly to do with having coloured letters and numbers that gives you this ability. It must be something under the surface, beneath the surface of this iceberg, if you will, that's doing that, because you just can't imagine the story that having colors for letters and numbers would directly influence your ability to do this. It must be something to do with their brains wired, something to do with their general disposition, their general way of thinking, of which synaesthesia is kind of an indicative marker, but to some extent the synaesthesia is not causally giving rise to this enhanced behavior. So I've said that synaesthesia can give you some of the abilities of autism without giving you the problems, and that is generally true, but there is a significant risk that you are going to get the problems. So within the synaesthetes, there is a subgroup of people who are very high on the autistic scale, including on social problems. And again, this relates to the number of kinds of synaesthesia you have. So remember, 0 means you don't have synaesthesia. This means you've got loads of synaesthesia. And here we're just looking at the tail end of the autism quotient. So those people who are reporting very high, clinically relevant levels of autism. And we find that around a third of these extreme synaesthetes would lie on the autism spectrum. Okay. So in a way, synaesthesia is giving you these gifts, these cognitive abilities, but you are sitting on a knife edge of getting things that you would not necessarily want to have, and that would include autism. Here, this is also looking at autism, but this is looking at the relatives of people with synaesthesia. So we took about 300 synaesthetes and we said, do you have autistic people within your family? And we did the same thing to controls. And here we can look at, initially we asked, are these people diagnosed with autism? And these are in blue. And then people wrote in the text, well, my son hasn't got a diagnosis, but I'd be amazed if he didn't have this. And these are the people who agree. It actually doesn't matter how we cut the data. If you are a synaesthete, you are likely to have family members with autism. Well, not likely, more likely, that is. But you're not more likely to have family members with schizophrenia. So this is looking at the relatives of synaesthetes and asking, do you have schizophrenia in your family? If you're a synaesthete, you're not likely to have schizophrenia. And again, this is interesting. Schizophrenia is associated with anomalous perceptual experiences. Autism traditionally is not. Okay. So here, the clinical association between synaesthesia and autism is quite specific. We do not find it for schizophrenia, we do not find it for depression, and we do not find it for migraine. So again, it's not that people with synaesthesia have mental health problems. I think that would be a mischaracterization. It is quite specific, the sorts of things that they have. Another one that they do have is post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, this really puzzled me when I looked at this. Here on the right, these are studies that were done in soldiers, in military personnel in the United States. And what they did is that they looked within these soldiers to see who has PTSD and who has Grapheme-Colour Synaesthesia. And in effect, you can calculate a kind of an odds ratio that these two things go together. Okay, one was initial study, the other was a replication study here. What we have in blue is a meta-analysis of risk factors for PTSD in military personnel. Okay, and these are all the ones here. What this data says is that one of the biggest risk factors for PTSD is having coloured letters and numbers. In fact, having coloured letters and numbers is almost as big a risk factor as the severity of the trauma itself that you were exposed to. So whether, how gory this particular event was. What's going on here? This is very puzzling. Again, what I would put to you is, can you think of a logical explanation where having coloured letters and numbers makes you more likely to suffer the effects of trauma? I can't, but the story that I can tell is that we know that these people with synaesthesia, these are people who think in mental images. They have very vivid mental imagery and they have very good memory. Okay. The characteristic of PTSD are flashbacks, that you relive events that happened to you years, maybe decades ago, and you re-experience them in a perceptual-like, vivid way, like this. So what I suggest is that it is the cognitive profile of synaesthesia that is making them susceptible to PTSD, rather than the superficial feature of having coloured letters and numbers. It is the stuff below the iceberg that is clinically important, rather than these anomalous experiences which are stuck on the top. Okay. And again, we can look at ways of unpicking that, but that for me is the only way of making sense of this data. Okay, so for the last 5 minutes, I'll just kind of give you an overview of why does synaesthesia actually exist. There are two possibilities here. One is that the synesthetic experiences themselves are like information. It tells you something about the world that you wouldn't otherwise know. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that synaesthesia is something of what's called a spandrel. So a spandrel is an architectural feature that you kind of get for free by constructing this. So in a way, synaesthesia is kind of a byproduct of other characteristics of the brain. And these other characteristics of the brain might be evolutionary adaptive, having good memory, having good perceptual abilities. These are things that could have been adapted for. But maybe synaesthesia was not adapted for, because these are just strange experiences. It's the stuff beneath the surface that is adapted for. And that's obviously what the argument that I'm pushing a little bit. But I don't completely discount this first one in some situations. So could synaesthesia act as information in its own right? So here, imagine a situation that you are trying to identify what this letter is. Is knowing that the letter A is also red, that extra information, going to be helpful? Well, obviously, I'm not a synaesthete, and I can see that that's a letter A, and I don't need it to be red to tell me that. But imagine that, for example, this is presented unconsciously, or you present it very briefly. If I could then get a red percept, I could then figure out it was a letter A without having seen it. That would be great if it's true, but it's not true. There have been a whole set of studies looking at whether you can get synaesthesia from an unconscious presentation of a stimulus. And the answer is probably not. That seems to be the case. So it would be nice if it's true, but it doesn't seem to be the case. This is an interesting example where synaesthesia could look like information. And this is the hearing motion. So remember the dots at the beginning. So what we've got here is that we've got two sequences of flashes. And your task is to say whether the two sequences of flashes are same or different. Okay. Now imagine you're a synaesthete. When you see these flashes, you might hear beep, 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 and so on. What you find is that synaesthetes who have this particular variety are good at this visual task. And the explanation of this is that they are recoding this visual information in an auditory sense, and the auditory sense can then enable them to read off that information more accurately. Okay, so this seems to be a good example of synaesthesia as information bearing, if you will. But I find a problem in this logic, and the problem is that how can you have kind of a low fidelity or a low quality kind of temporal resolution here being translated into a good auditory resolution? So the auditory resolution cannot be a higher quality than the visual information that is inducing it. That doesn't make any sense. So what I think is happening here is not necessarily synaesthesia as information bearing. It's just that you are just, by virtue of recoding it, you are putting it into different kinds of working memory systems. And maybe your auditory short-term memory just enables you to remember that information in a better way. So it's not synaesthesia as information. It's just that you can hold on to the information longer by virtue of recoding it. So again, synaesthesia is giving perhaps a direct cognitive advantage, but maybe in a more subtle way than we imagine. And there are lots of anecdotes from synaesthetes about how they use their synaesthesia. So in English, this is a notoriously difficult word to spell, so separate. A lot of people put a letter E there. A synaesthete might be resistant to doing that because they can see these letter A's as a kind of a gestalt by virtue of having the same color. But in this case, it's not necessarily the case that the synaesthetes can see or that things, well, they can see things that others don't, but it's not really new information because the information is already there for others. What it is kind of new opportunities for using information. So the synaesthesia can be a tool. It can be used as a kind of a cognitive aid, but in a way that's very specific to that kind of synaesthesia. So here, having colored letters for numbers could be a cognitive tool, but having taste for that is not going to help you figure out the spelling. Okay, so it's quite a niche ability that these forms of synaesthesia give. The alternative view is that synaesthesia is something as a spandrel, by which I mean that it's not a direct product of evolutionary selection. It's something you get for free. It's a byproduct of other differences and abilities in the brain. In a way, what this means is that synaesthesia isn't the things that we should necessarily be interested in. It's the synaesthetic brain type. It's the stuff below the surface of the iceberg that's more interesting, because this is what's give rise to perhaps differences in creativity, the enhanced memory, these perceptual abilities. That's finding a needle in a haystack, the kind of things that synaesthetes are good at. Okay, this is probably the thing that we're interested in. So this is a bit of a summary, is that basically synaesthesia almost certainly is underpinned by genetic differences leading to differences in brain development, in connectivity and so on. The thing that I've argued is that there is a profile, a cognitive profile of what it is to be a synaesthete. And these might kind of be what I call a synaesthetic disposition that's interesting in its own right. We find it to some extent in the relatives of synaesthetes. So in effect, if you imagine development coming here, you could stop your development here, in effect, and you could have all the cognitive characteristics of being a synaesthete, and you would be perhaps good at art, good at change blindness, good memory, but you would not have synaesthesia itself. So that's what I mean about the function of synaesthesia being rather kind of narrow. You can have all the abilities and cognitive profile of synaesthesia without having it. But synaesthesia is a thing that gives you the clue to this kind of rich inner scenery of thinking, this different cognitive profile. And in effect, what I've got going down here is this kind of probabilistic development, that the greater the push, the greater the differences in these kind of cognitive changes, and the more synaesthesia is likely to emerge multiple times in your brain, in effect. So we can think of synaesthesia as a sort of alt-normal. People with synaesthesia think differently. So going back to William James, they have a different kind of intelligence, a different cognition. But we can think of it as kind of an alt-normal. It's a different way of being normal. They're kind of a hidden subgroup within the neurotypical population. A synaesthete doesn't need to go to their doctors. They are cognitively very able, but they may have particular clinical vulnerabilities. In a way, what this is kind of arguing for is kind of a neuropsychology of individual differences, that within the kind of the general population, rather than imagine it as a kind of a bell curve like this, we can imagine a lumpy set of individual differences that are driven by differences in our genes, differences in the brain profile. And we don't have to pathologize these differences. To show we don't have to pathologize these differences, these are not my collaborators. These are my inspirational kind of subjects, and these are famous people with synaesthesia. But I would like to thank the synaesthesia research team at Sussex, as well as thank you guys for listening.